here. We are holding Shoftim, the book of Judges, chapter 3. Nope, chapter 4. Chapter 4. And we spoke about last week the war against Eglon, the king of Moab, and the shofet at the time was Ehud ben Gera, Ehud. So we've learned already about Asniel, the son of Kenaz. He was the first shofet, the first judge. Then we had Ehud ben Gera. He was the second. And we learned about this, the trick he played on Eglon, the king of Moab, because Eglon was causing the Jewish people a lot of suffering. They took over the land of Eretz Yisrael. Really, Moab, the country of Moab, was on the eastern side of the border and of the Jordan River, the eastern side of the Jordan River. And Moab conquered the land of Israel and actually built themselves an area in Jericho, like a palace there for a local location for their government buildings. And the Jewish people were suffering so much from Moab, they begged Hashem, and Hashem gave them the shofet called Ehud ben Gera, and he came up with this plan. Now, what he ended up doing, we spoke about last week, that since he was a lefty, he was able to trick the king of Moab and stab him. Because he was a lefty, he had his sword in his right on his right side, and they didn't really look there because most people are right-handed, and therefore they normally look on the left side. That's where a righty would put their sword. And so he ended up tricking the king of Moab and killed him. Now, I wanted to clarify something that...
Excuse me, this is Ehud you're talking about?
Yeah, Ehud ben Gera, that's right. He was the second shofet, the second judge.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Last week I implied that this all took place in their city of Jericho. However, I see that there are commentaries that make it very clear. They make it clear that it actually took place in Eglon's main location outside of the land of Israel. So what happened was Eglon, the king of Moab, had a location in Israel, but he also, his main place, his main capital was outside of Israel on the east side of the Jordan River. And that's where this story took place. Ehud killed him there, and then he ran back to Israel, and they blocked off the Jordan River. So the local Moabite people, they were able to kill out all of the Moabite soldiers that were stationed inside Israel, and they blocked the outside Moabites from coming to help. And that's basically the story from last week. I'm not sure if I mentioned that Eglon, the king of Moab, the way he was killed was Ehud, the shofet, the judge. He came to Eglon and he told him, I have a word from God to tell you. And Eglon stood up. And right when he stood up, it was very hard for him to stand up because he was extremely, extremely overweight. And by the time he stood up, it gave Ehud time to stick the sword into his stomach. Now, because Eglon stood up, he was given a special gift that his granddaughter would become Jewish and a great leader. And that was Ruth, the grandmother of King David, the great grandmother of King David. that was the merit of Eglon standing up, even though he was a wicked person and he did terrible things to the Jewish people. Nevertheless, he did get rewarded that his great-granddaughter or his granddaughter, his descendant, would become Jewish, and she would be the great-grandmother of King David and the whole dynasty of King David. So that was from last week. And we concluded last week that there was one other, the third Shofet, the third judge. His name was Shamgar, and he only lasted a few months. And it just tells about him in one verse, the final verse of chapter 3. It tells us about Shamgar, how he did have a confrontation with the Plishtim, and he smote 600 men with a cattle goad, and he also saved Israel. However, the reason why we don't find any great salvation in his time, we only find this small episode, is because the Jewish people were not on the level where they deserved to have a great rescue. And therefore, because they weren't so righteous, they were still, worshiping their idols and so on. So therefore, his salvation was not a great salvation, and his reign only lasted a short amount of time. The reason why he reigned was, it says that Ehud was old and couldn't be the judge, and therefore Shamgar was chosen. Now we're up to chapter 4. We're going to read the chapter 4 from verse 1. The children of Israel continued to do what was evil in the eyes of Hashem once Ehud died. And that is an interesting verse because it sort of leaves out Shamgar. It jumps back to, to Ehud, but what about Shamgar? And the reason why, it doesn't mention about Shamgar is because his reign is even considered like part of Ehud's reign. Another reason is because he didn't really convince the Jewish people to serve Hashem properly. And because he wasn't successful at bringing the Jewish people to a high level of trust in Hashem, faith in Hashem, therefore his reign is not really counted in this verse. It's not mentioned, and it just is sort of like included in the reign of Ehud. And it says that after Ehud died, that's when the Jewish people continued doing what was evil in the eyes of Hashem. Now, verse 2 says, Hashem delivered them into the hands of Yavin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Chatzor. The general of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Charoshes Goyim. So we have here this Canaanite king. And one of the unique things about what's going on here in Shoftim at this point is that until now we were dealing with foreigners. Now we are dealing with one of the nations that we are commanded to destroy, the Canaanites. And we actually were irresponsible by not destroying them. And we were suffering greatly in the hands of this Canaanite king. Now, there is a little issue that the commentaries have to deal with here, and that is that we did speak in Joshua about destroying the city of Chatzar and conquering it. So how is Yavin, the king of Chatzar, still alive? So there are two approaches. Either they destroyed the city, but Chatzar was able to wasn't killed, and he ended up reorganizing and getting together the nation of the Canaanites, the remnants, I guess, of the Canaanites, or from different areas, the Canaanites, and ultimately they hired him again as king, or he chose to be king and forced his way into kingship. And so ultimately, Yavin was still around now. The other way of understanding it is that just like Pharaoh is the name of the king of Egypt, and there was numerous pharaohs, so the same thing is with Chatzar, that yes, we conquered it, we killed the king, but years later, someone else took over. Someone else, other people that were Canaanites, they came and decided to live there, and they ultimately conquered us, and they ultimately won over the Jewish people. They took over that city, and they named the king Yavin because that's the name the king of Chatzar was always called, Yavin. So those are the two approaches of how to explain how it's not a contradiction between the story and Joshua. So this this place where the general of Sisera, the general of the army, his name is Sisera, and he is living in this place called Charoshes Hagoyim. Now, Charoshes Hagoyim means fortress of the nations, or it could mean the craftsman of the nations. But basically, it suggests that the nations collaborated in building this city, which which seems to be they were a strong army, to the extent that if we look at the next verse, that really says it all. The Jewish people, the children of Israel, cried out to Hashem. We're in verse 3. For Sisera had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the children of Israel forcefully for 20 years. And so the Jewish people were truly suffering. They were crying out desperately for Hashem's help. And there was 3 reasons, which we see in this verse, why that was so. Number 1, Sisera had these 900 iron chariots. The Jewish people had 0. So these iron chariots were powerful. It's almost like a nuclear weapon. You can't really fight it. And additionally, the reason why we were crying out to Hashem was the second point in the verse. He oppressed the children of Israel forcefully. He was extremely cruel. And
Rabbi Smith.
Yes.
Does the name Charoshes have any relationship to the spice we put on our fish?
I think Charoshes is spelled with a samach. The Charoshes in the Haggadah. So it's actually spelled a little differently, but good thought.
Not have any relationship, I guess.
I don't believe so. So the second thing, that the reason why we were crying out to Hashem was they were oppressing us in a very strong way, additionally humiliating way, and they were cursing Hashem. Additionally, the third thing is that it was going on for a long time, 20 years, which was a very long time to suffer, at least at that time, from the hands of the enemies.
A question?
Yeah.
Verse 3, where I have that the Israelites cried out to the Lord. Were they crying for help? You just said they were cursing Hashem?
No, the enemies were cursing Hashem.
Oh, didn't hear that right.
The enemy, I said there were 3 reasons why the Jews were crying out to Hashem, because the enemies were humiliating them and Hashem. They were, and that's what you see in the verse. The three like commas, I guess you could say, 900 iron chariots, the oppression to the Jewish people with strength, and the 20 years. So that's the way the commentaries understand it. Now, we're on verse 4, and here we have something very unique, and that is that a Jewish woman is going to lead not only the women, but she's leading the entire Jewish nation. And it's something, I must say, very interesting, because although we have the story in the Torah where Miriam leads and is a great leader and a prophetess, but we find that she leads the women. And here we have a woman that was leading the Jewish people. Now, what it also says is that the reason why she led the Jewish people was, unfortunately, there was no one so righteous among the men. And she was really like the biggest scholar and holiest person. And so Devorah, she was a prophetess. Here we're going to read verse 4. Devorah was a prophetess, and it says she was Ashes Lapidos, a fiery woman, or a woman of that made wicks for the tabernacle. Or her husband's name
was a hot broad.
There are a number of translations here. Why she's called the wife of Ashes Lapidos. Literally, Ashes Lapidos would mean lapid is a flame. So she was the wife of a flame. So we're going to learn soon, we're going to soon mention that there was another man whose name was Barak. Barak also means a flash of lightning. So according to that, it's possible, so one of the commentaries explains that she was married to him. She was married to him, and that's why it says she was Ashes Lapidos, the wife of Lapidos, because Lapidos and Barak really mean the same thing. The other explanations of what Lapidos means, either she was a fiery woman, which means she was very extremely capable and energetic. And another explanation is that she would make the wicks for the tabernacle that was situated in Shiloh. And so she was this, that was her, I guess, gift to the tabernacle. She would make the wicks, and she specifically made very thick wicks, it says in the Medrash. She would make very thick wicks because she wanted a lot of light for the Beis Hamikdash. Yes, Gloria.
Is it possible she was referred to as fiery because she had bright red hair?
It doesn't mention that, so we don't know.
Okay.
I didn't see that, but that's the commentaries don't mention that. But normally we think of fiery as someone who has a lot of anger or gets angry very easily, but that doesn't seem to fit with the type of person we're talking about, being that she was so righteous and such a holy person that it wouldn't seem that she was fiery in that sense. So there is an explanation in the Medrash that her husband was not as knowledgeable as she was, and therefore when she made these wicks for the tabernacle, she would send her husband to bring them to the tabernacle so that he would become connected to the holy Kohanim in the tabernacle and the Levites, and maybe it would influence her husband to be more learned. And supposedly it worked, and he was growing in his in his studies. And that's a famous thing in Torah, that the woman is supposed to be an inspiration to her husband. She's supposed to encourage him to learn. And it says, in fact, that Nashia b'mai zachyan, the Gemara says, what are the women, what do they get merit for? It's that they encourage their husbands to study Torah, and their children and their sons to go study Torah. So they get merit when they, and we know that the woman has a tremendous power over her husband. Where do we know that from? Well, the first sin. The first sin. Eve convinced her husband to sin. We also know the story of Korath. And Korath was a rebellious man against Moses. And who really pushed him to continue his rebellion? His wife. So we see that the woman has tremendous power for negative and, more importantly, for positive. And so here here we have with Devorah encouraging her husband to hang out in the tabernacle in Shiloh. Now, I'm gonna start again, verse 4. Devorah was a prophetess, a fiery woman. She judged Israel at that time. She would sit under the palm tree of Devorah. Between Ramah and Basel on Mount Ephraim, and the children of Israel would go up to her for judgment. So there are a few questions that have to be asked here, and that is, it seems to mention Devorah a second time, which doesn't seem necessary. Why do we have to call this the palm tree of Devorah if she would sit under it? Should say her palm tree. She would sit under her palm tree. And additionally, it mentions a lot of locations here. Bein Harama, Bein Basel, Har Ephraim. So and why did she sit under this palm tree? What was the reason for it? So the reason why she sat under a palm tree was, the Talmud says, because she didn't want to sin with secluding herself with men. And as righteous as a person may be, they're not allowed to seclude themselves with, a man can't seclude himself with a woman. A woman can't seclude herself with a man unless they're married. And the good thing about a palm tree is that there aren't so many lower branches. The branches are higher up, and so everything is visible to the public. And the fact that everything is visible to the public makes it considered 100% tznius and modest. And that's why she would, that was her location. That was her office. Her office was outside. So even though, it might not have been the most comfortable place, being outside and subject to the elements that are outside, nevertheless, that's where she set up her location. Now, the Talmud also says that just like a date has only one heart, which means it has one pit, so too the Jews of the time, they were devoted to Hashem with all their heart. What that means is that although there was idol worship and so on. But when she came to power, they did have tremendous allegiance to Hashem. And additionally, it was to the credit of the people that they would have to travel to her. And even though she was as a woman judge, they brought their cases to her and respected her. So they followed, there is a law in the Torah that a person is not supposed to bring their cases to outside governments. And there's a certain respect when you bring a case to a leader of the Jewish people, to a shofet, to a judge that's Jewish, that's going to follow the Jewish laws. And so here, they would bring their case. It was obviously humiliating a little that they're bringing their case, to at least the way a lot of men would see it. They would feel that it's humiliating, and the fact that that there aren't any men in the league of where they should of being knowledgeable, and so nevertheless they did use her as the judge. Now, I mentioned that it doesn't seem to mention Devorah. Like, why does it call it the Tomer Devorah, the palm tree? So there is a commentary that it's referring to Devorah, not this Devorah, but there was an earlier Devorah in the Chumash. Where do we find the Devorah in the Chumash? Well, Rivka had a maid. Her name was Devorah. And she had sent Devorah to go tell Jacob. Rivka sent her maid to tell Jacob he can now return because Esau is not so angry anymore. So Devorah had traveled all the way to Lavan's house to tell Jacob that he can return now. And when Jacob finally returned, Jacob, after being there for 20 years, he did return. I don't know how long she ended up staying, waiting for Jacob to return, but probably soon thereafter, Jacob did return. And when he returned, she passed away along the road. And that is possibly, according to one opinion, I should say, this reason why this palm tree is called Tomer Devorah, because it says she was buried tachas ha'oloin, and it was called aloin bachus. So she was buried like under a tree. So that's why they're calling this a Tomer Devorah, the palm tree of Devorah, of the nurse of the nurse in the Chumash, the nurse of Rivka, which mentions in the Chumash. But other commentaries learned that this was the Devorah herself, and it mentions it because you're not supposed to read it, the palm tree of Devorah. You're supposed to read it, the palm tree. She would dwell under the palm tree, and Devorah goes on the next sentence. Devorah was between Harama and Beisel in Har Ephraim, and it's a continuation to the next sentence. She was always there between. She was constantly there, and people would always travel. In other words, she didn't travel around. She stayed there, so people would know where to come, and they would always be able to find her there. That's the Metzudas David. That's one of the commentaries. Another commentary is that she was a very wealthy woman, and all of these locations are telling us that she had palm trees in this city, and she had olive trees in another city, and a vineyard in another city. And that's why it mentions all these cities to show that she was extremely wealthy. And
Oh, Rabbi Smith, the Devorah that's in the Chumash, is she the one that has an isolated pasuk pretty much all to herself? I mean, the name Deborah does not come up anywhere else. Am I right?
what are you asking?
The name Deborah that's in the Chumash.
Yes.
We kind of have a pasuk all to herself. In other words, Deborah in the Chumash does not come up anywhere else. Anywhere else there. Am I right?
I mean, what do you mean anywhere else? It's in the Chumash. It does say it in the Chumash.
No, I'm sorry. In the Chumash, does her name come up a
Yes.
second time in the Chumash?
Well, it says Vatamas Devorah Meinekes Rivka. It does say it. You want to know how many times it says it in the Chumash?
How many times does her name come up in Chumash?
I don't know. How many times does Abraham come up in Chumash? I mean, it's a. I don't know. I never counted. I'm sure you could look it up in a concordancia. You could probably find it.
I think I have. I just wasn't sure, but I think her name only comes up once in the Chumash.
Very possible. She's definitely not the a main figure, but it is mentioned there. It's definitely mentioned once with that verse. But why do you care if it was mentioned once or more than once?
Because I've seen it once and it just seems isolated from the rest of the narrative.
Right, and that's obvious, right? Because there's no reason. I mean, it's not like she was famous for anything specific.
Right. That's
So
why.
that's not surprising at all. Okay, so we were mentioning that Devorah was she owned property and in different areas, and that's the way some of the commentaries, at least Rashi learns that way. She had tamarim date palms in Jericho. She had vineyards in Ramah, zaysim olive trees in Basel, and white sand in Har Ephraim. And let me see if the other commentary says the same thing.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Just 1 second. Okay, I don't see. Yeah, that seems like Rashi's explanation. Yes.
I was just wondering if Gerald Epstein was asking if there were other Devorahs. At least that's one of the things I was curious about some time ago. And the Hertz Chumash has an index, and again, it only came up there. But does this coincidence, like that Devorah, this Devorah, because there's a meaning to the name? Most of these names come from something. Nathaniel, gift of God. Does Devorah have a meaning as a name?
Well, Devorah means a bee.
Bee, like the pollinator, the insect?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So there could be
That
more
makes
than
honey. 1 second. That don't seek negative. Bee that makes honey.
Honeybee.
That's
There
the
you go.
insect,
Okay,
not the insect.
So that would very likely explain two Devorahs, but one is not named after the other.
Well, that I don't know. Maybe she is named after the other Devorah.
Oh, okay.
It's very possible.
That's good.
It's very possible. The place to look for this would be in the Medrash, because the Medrash does connect this Tomer Devorah to the Devorah of the Chumash.
Ah, yes.
Or actually, the Abarbanel mentions this. So, so that would be a place to look. Okay, we're going to continue on. We're on verse 6. She went and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam of Keresh Naphtali, and said to him, behold, Hashem, the God of Israel, has commanded, go and convince the people to go toward Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men from the children of Naphtali and from the children of Zebulun. So she summoned Barak that he should go to war. And he's got to take 10,000 troops. And this is it is interesting the way it says it. She sent and summoned Barak. Now, why did she summon him? Isn't this her husband, at least according to one opinion? So one of the explanations is that he was hanging out in the tabernacle. Another explanation says that because she was a prophetess, she actually separated from Barak. And this way, if she was she wouldn't be impure if they ever had relations. And this is a surprising thing, because normally we only find that with Moses. None of the other prophets needed to separate from their spouse. So it's definitely an interesting, innovative explanation here that she would have separated from him. But there is such a explanation. And
aren't we commanded to have children if we're married?
Well, what happens after a person has had children?
Separated later. Okay.
So obviously now, right? Obviously, we're not dealing with a simple sin like that. So she wants Barak, and not she wants. She has a command from Hashem that Barak should lead this war. And she says, behold, Hashem, the God of Israel, has commanded to go and convince them. So verse 7 says, I will draw towards you to Kishon Brook, Sisera, the general of Yavin's army, with his chariot and his multitude, and I shall deliver him into your hand. And what we see here is that Barak is supposed to convince the people. What is Barak's job? Barak's job was that convince the people to go toward Mount Tabor and take 10,000 men and basically fight the war. So he's got two jobs, really. Number one is to convince the people to join you. And number two, it's to in addition to joining, to getting these troops to join, it's also to fight the war, to be the commander-in-chief of the war. Now, what happens when it comes to Sisera? With Sisera, Hashem is saying, I am going to arrange that they will just come by divine providence. In other words, I'm gonna direct them. I will draw them towards you. So what we basically see is that Barak has got to do the job. Hashem isn't just drawing these people to follow Barak. When it comes to Sisera, Hashem will join them. Hashem will lead them towards him. And the verse continues, Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I will not go. And so Barak wants Devorah to help him. And he felt that maybe she had more merit. And so he wanted her to join. And what did Devorah say? She said, indeed, I will go with you, but the path on which you have chosen to go will not be for your glory, for Hashem will have delivered Sisera into the hand of a woman. And then Devorah got up and went with Barak to Kadesha. And so the commentaries explain here that there's two parts of honor by a war. Number one is leading the army that wins. When you lead the army that wins, you are honored. The second thing that people like when they fight a war is the person who actually kills the enemy king. So in other words, that's a big honor as well. There's two ways of getting honor when you fight a war. And Yael tells him, well, the killing the king you're not going to get, because the killing of the king is going to end up going to a woman. There's going to be a woman who's going to kill the king. What you might be able to get is the fact that you led a successful war, a successful army, and you won the war. Now, if you're going to have me go with you, you're not even going to get that part of it. So that's really where this verse comes in, where Devorah tells him that, you know, the hand and Sisera, who's the general of the army, of the enemy army, that's going to be won over by a woman. And now you're not going to have the glory of leading the Jewish army. Now, ultimately, Devorah and Barak go together. Barak mustered Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men ascended in his footsteps, and Devorah went up with him. So they're going to fight the war. Verse 11, Hever the Canaanite had become separated from the Canaanites, from the children of Chovav, the father-in-law of Moshe, and pitched his tents as far as Zaananim, which is near Kadesh. And what that means is that we're going to soon see that there's a couple, Hever and Yael, that are involved in this war. They are actually Jewish, but they're not from any of the tribes. And the reason why they're not connected to any of the tribes, because they are converts. And they were part of their entire group of their, they had quite a dynasty, the Canaanite dynasty of converts to the Jewish people. They were Yisro's family, Jethro. Jethro is also called Jethro was called
Hobab.
No, he had 7 names. Yisro, Chovav, Hever. I think one of them was Cani. So that is this dynasty, this family. And we learned a little about them in the book of Joshua, where they studied, where did we learn about them? They went to travel to Osniel ben Kenaz. They studied under Osniel. Osniel was the first Shoftim, and this group went and traveled there, and they studied under his teachings. And however, Hever did not go with them. This individual, him and his wife, they stayed in this area, and they didn't travel. So it's interesting because some of these, some of the family, they wanted to study by a great scholar, and one of the greatest scholars was Osniel. Osniel ben Kenaz, who was the first shofet, the first judge, and the family of the Canaanites, meaning this family of Jethro, some of them were really into their studies. They really wanted a good teacher, and so they actually studied and became quite scholarly, studying under Osniel. Now, this individual here, Heber, he didn't travel. He stayed here in this location, and his wife Yael, we'll soon see, is very involved in this story. So he became separated from the Canaanites. That's what the verse 11 means. From the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moshe, and he pitched his tent as far as in this area near Kedesh. So this is right near where the war is happening. That's where they're living. They told Sisera, we're in verse 12, they told Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, they told Sisera that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor. And Sisera mustered all his chariots, the 900 iron chariots, and all the people who were with him from Charoshes Goyim to Kishon Brook. So Sisera got all of these chariots together, and he gathered all of his army and his chariots, his entire army. Now, really, he shouldn't have needed too many people to fight this war. There's only 10,000 Jewish soldiers. It's a very small army compared to what Sisera had. He didn't need to bring everyone. He definitely did not need for his 10,000 people. He didn't need 900 iron chariots either. But nevertheless, Hashem arranged that he would bring everything there. And we're in verse 14. And Devorah said to Barak, "Arise, for this is the day when Hashem has delivered Sisera into your hand. Behold, Hashem has gone forth before you." So Barak descended from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men behind him. Now, this itself shows that he was, the Abarbanel brings that it shows that he was quite, he had faith in Hashem, because it's much better to be on a mountain than to be in a valley. And here, Devorah tells him he's got to descend from Mount Tabor and fight in the valley. And that shows that he, dropped all of his strategy of war and his unique advantage and followed what he was supposed to do. And all the 10,000 Jews followed after him, even though they didn't hear the prophecy directly. And they didn't even hear it indirectly. They just followed him. And verse 15, Hashem confounded Sisera and all the chariots and the entire camp by the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera dismounted from his chariot and fled on his feet. So what happened here is that somehow, even before Barak arrived, Hashem had already confused Sisera and all of his soldiers, confused them. And they became afraid and scared. And they started hearing sounds. The reason why they became afraid was they were hearing sounds of the enemy. And even though it's not true, the enemy was just walking by foot. Nevertheless, Sisera and his army, miraculously, of course, Hashem made this great miracle that they were confused and they became full of fear and they tried to escape. And what we see here is also something interesting, that Barak didn't even arrive and they're already confounded. That it's like Barak just had to take that first step in a certain sense. He just had to take that first step, that leap of faith, and Hashem basically did the rest. And Barak chased, we're in verse 16. For those that arrived late, we're chapter 4 of the book of Shoftim, verse 16. Barak chased after the chariots and after the camp until Charoshes Goyim. And the entire camp of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not even one was left. And the only one who did escape was Sisera himself, the general. And that's verse 17. Sisera fled on his feet to the tent of Yael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, for there was peace between Yavin, the king of Chatzor, and the house of Heber the Canaanite. So what we see, what we mentioned earlier, was that Heber and his wife Yael, they had a good relationship with this nation of Canaan. Yavin, the king of Chatzor, these Canaanites, and the reason they had, they were, in a certain sense, they could, I guess, play both roles because they were converts to Judaism. They weren't born into it, so they could, sort of be at peace with the enemy. And so when Sisera was running away, Yael saw Sisera, and she figured, oh, now I have a good opportunity to somehow, and she didn't know yet how, but she figured somehow I'll be able to kill Sisera. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to allow him to hide in my tent. And the reason he's going to want to hide in my tent instead of hide somewhere else is because generally they're not going to come to a woman's tent to look for the king's the chief commanding officer of the army. So Sisera was running, and she invited him. Yael, 18, Yael went out to Sisera and said, "Turn aside, my lord. Turn aside to me. Do not fear." So he turned aside to her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. And verse 19 is, he said to her, Give me now a bit of water to drink, because I am thirsty. And imagine, he had a hard day. His whole army was killed, running and being chased, and so didn't have a very good day. It was not an easy day. He wanted a good drink. It was outside all day, so he asked her if she could give him a drink of water. The verse, she opened a skin of milk and gave him to drink and covered him. Use the term a skin of milk. It's a utensil. It's a vessel that they would keep milk in, a certain, like a leather container. And so she opened this and gave him to drink, and she covered him. And now we're up to verse 20. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and it shall be that if any man will come and ask you and say, 'Is anyone here?' you shall say no." And so, of course, he's trying to hide. Now, why was it so important to kill Sisera? He's one person. The reason is because if he survives, he'll recruit a new army. They'll again return to attack the Jewish people. And so Yael realized that this was an opportunity, and it was a very important mission that God gave her, this special opportunity. And we're now in verse 21. Yael, the wife of Hever, took a tent peg and placed the hammer in her hand, came to him stealthily, and drove the peg into his temple, and it went through into the ground while he was sleeping deeply and exhausted, and he died. So she checked it. She gave him milk. Why did she give him milk? Because milk makes a person thirsty. And I'm not thirsty, makes a person tired. Milk makes a person tired. And she then pretended that she's fixing the tent. So she had the peg of the tent, and she figured, if she sees it looks like he might be sleeping, she decided even if he wakes up, it would just look like she's fixing her tent. I guess common issue with tents is that the peg falls loose or something. So she could just say, I'm just fixing it. And then, of course, she went closer to him, and quite courageous of her, and she took her hammer and she banged it into his temple. And it went all the way through into the ground. I mean, that's quite deep. She wanted to make sure she got it through. She did the job fully, completely. She didn't leave anything unturned. And he died. Verse 22 is, behold, Barak had been pursuing Sisera, and Yael went out towards him and told him, come, I will show you the man whom you seek. And he came to her house, and behold, Sisera was fallen dead with the peg in his temple. And on that day, Hashem subjugated Yavin, the king of Canaan, before the children of Israel. The hand of the children of Israel became progressively harsh over Yavin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed Yavin, the king of Canaan. So Yavin was weakened, and there was no longer any of his army, any of his people really with any power alive to make problems. So that really concludes this chapter. Next chapter is about the song that Devorah sang afterwards, and Mitzvah Hashem will do that next week. Does anyone have any questions?